The first snow of winter fell softly on Thomas Reed's cabin in the Cascade Mountains. He watched the flakes drift past his window, each one catching the late afternoon light like tiny falling stars. After 15 years as a military combat medic, he thought he'd seen everything the world had to offer. He was wrong. The tremor came first, subtle enough that he might have missed it if he hadn't been holding his coffee mug. Ripples formed in the dark liquid, spreading outward in perfect circles. Then came the sound, a low, resonant hum that made his teeth ache and set his combat-trained nerves on edge. Thomas grabbed his medical bag out of pure habit. In his experience, unusual phenomena often led to people needing help. He stepped outside into the crisp mountain air, scanning the treeline for any sign of disturbance. The snow was falling heavier now, reducing visibility to a few hundred yards. The hum grew stronger, and Thomas felt it in his bones. He followed the sensation, moving carefully through the woods. The trees thinned out ahead, opening into one of the many hidden valleys that dotted this part of the mountains. As he reached the edge of the clearing, he stopped dead in his tracks. Two enormous figures stood in the valley, their heads nearly brushing the low-hanging clouds. The taller one, easily 60 feet high, had skin that seemed to shift between deep purple and midnight blue, like the northern lights made flesh. Beside her, a smaller figure, perhaps 40 feet tall, shared the same ethereal coloring but glowed with a soft, pulsing light. Thomas's first instinct was to run. Every survival instinct screamed at him to retreat, to hide, to pretend he'd never seen this impossible sight. But then he noticed something that changed everything: they were injured. The larger figure was protecting her left side, and even from this distance, he could see the telltale signs of trauma he'd learned to recognize in countless war zones. The smaller one, a child, he realized with a start, was helping support the larger one, who must be her mother. They were trying to activate something on their wrists, but whatever technology they were using seemed to be malfunctioning. Sparks of light flickered around them, like a failing force field. "I can help," Thomas called out before he could stop himself. His voice carried across the valley, and both figures turned to look at him. Their eyes glowed like distant galaxies, filled with equal parts fear and desperation. The mother pulled her child closer, raising her other hand in a defensive gesture. But Thomas could see the tremor in her movement, the way she favored her injured side. He'd seen that look countless times before, the determination of a parent to protect their child, even at the cost of their own life. He set his medical bag down slowly and raised his hands. "I'm a doctor," he said clearly, taking a small step forward. "A healer. You're hurt. Let me help." The child said something in a language that sounded like singing wind chimes. The mother responded, her voice deeper but equally melodic. They seemed to be debating, all while keeping their eyes fixed on Thomas. Finally, the mother nodded, though she didn't lower her guard. Thomas picked up his bag and approached slowly, his mind racing. How does one treat a 60-foot-tall alien? The principles should be the same, he told himself. Anatomy might be different, but trauma was trauma. As he got closer, he could see that their skin wasn't just colored like the aurora, it actually moved and shifted like the northern lights. Their clothing seemed to be made of something between liquid metal and silk, though it was torn and damaged in several places. "My name is Thomas," he said, tapping his chest. "Thomas Reed." The mother touched her own chest with long, elegant fingers. "Venna," she said, her voice carrying harmonics that made the air vibrate. She gestured to her child. "Luna." The name seemed to be a translation, chosen for his benefit. Luna peeked out from behind her mother's leg, her glow brightening slightly. She was young, perhaps the equivalent of a 6 or 7-year-old human child, though Thomas could only guess at their species' aging process. "Can you show me where you're hurt?" Thomas asked, gesturing to Venna's side. Venna hesitated, then carefully knelt down, bringing herself closer to his level. Even kneeling, she towered above him. She moved her hand away from her side, revealing a wound that seemed to shimmer and shift like oil on water. Thomas had treated countless wounds, but never anything like this. Still, he could recognize the signs of energy weapon damage from his time in service. Someone had shot her, and recently. As he began to examine the wound more closely, a flicker of movement caught his eye. In the distance, something metallic glinted in the falling snow. His blood ran cold as he recognized the distinctive shape of a drone. They were being watched. Thomas made his decision in that moment. Whatever these beings were, whoever was hunting them, he couldn't leave them to face it alone. He'd sworn an oath to help those in need, and size didn't change that obligation. "You need shelter," he said urgently, pointing toward a nearby mountain. "There's an abandoned mining complex. We can hide you there until you heal." Venna and Luna exchanged looks, having another musical conversation. Then Venna nodded, carefully rising to her full height. Luna gripped her mother's hand tightly as Thomas began leading them toward the mountain. As they moved through the falling snow, Thomas couldn't help but wonder what he was getting himself into. But looking up at these enormous yet vulnerable beings, he knew one thing for certain: their lives were in his hands now, and he wouldn't let them down. The snow continued to fall, covering their tracks as they disappeared into the gathering dusk, while somewhere in the distance, a drone silently recorded everything. The abandoned mining complex appeared like a dark wound in the mountainside, its entrance partially obscured by decades of overgrowth. Thomas Reed led the way, his flashlight beam cutting through the shadows as he guided his enormous companions inside. Each step Venna took made the ground tremble, while Luna's natural glow cast strange, shifting shadows on the rock walls. "The main chamber should be big enough," Thomas called out, his voice echoing. The space had been carved out to house massive drilling equipment during the gold rush, creating a cathedral-like cavern deep within the mountain. Venna had to duck her head as she entered, but once inside, she could almost stand at her full height. Thomas had spent the last several hours setting up emergency lighting and basic supplies. The gentle hum of generators filled the space as industrial floodlights flickered to life, revealing the true scale of their shelter. Rusted mining equipment lay scattered about like ancient artifacts, and support beams stretched up into the darkness like the ribs of some prehistoric beast. Venna touched her wrist device again, and a holographic display sprang to life, filling the air with dancing symbols that cast ethereal patterns across the cave walls. Her expression grew increasingly troubled as she worked with the controls. Whatever technology had allowed them to stay hidden was failing. Thomas could see that much even without understanding their language. Luna wandered to a corner of the cavern, trailing her fingers along the rough stone walls. Where she touched, the rock crystallized, creating delicate, luminescent patterns that sparkled like stars. Thomas watched in amazement as the designs grew more complex, forming intricate geometric shapes that seemed to pulse with their own inner light. "That's incredible," he breathed, approaching slowly to study the crystalline formations. Luna glanced at him shyly before continuing her artwork, her small hands moving with surprising precision for a child her size. Venna made a sound like distant thunder rolling through mountains, what Thomas was beginning to recognize as their version of a sigh. She knelt down, bringing herself closer to his level, and began drawing in the dusty floor beside Luna's crystal patterns. Her movements were deliberate as she created what looked like a star map, complete with swirling galaxies and interconnected systems. She pointed to one particular spot, then traced a long line across the map, finally indicating their current location on Earth. Thomas studied the drawing, his military training kicking in as he estimated distances and potential pursuit routes. "How far behind you are they?" he asked, miming looking over his shoulder. Before Venna could respond, Luna suddenly stopped drawing. Her natural glow dimmed noticeably, and she pressed closer to her mother, making a sound like wind chimes in a storm. Venna's head snapped up, her galaxy-like eyes scanning the cave entrance with sudden intensity. Thomas rushed to check the surveillance equipment he'd set up, a collection of motion sensors and cameras borrowed from old military contacts who didn't ask too many questions. The monitors showed nothing unusual, but he'd learned to trust gut feelings, especially those of children. They often sensed danger before adults did. He grabbed his binoculars and headed to the observation post he'd established near the cave entrance. The snow had started falling again, limiting visibility, but something caught his eye high in the atmosphere, a metallic glint that moved too purposefully to be a satellite or space debris. "They're getting closer," he muttered, returning to the main chamber. Venna was already working on her wrist device again, looking increasingly frustrated as sparks of energy crackled around her without forming a stable field. Luna watched her mother work while continuing to create crystal patterns, but Thomas noticed something different about these new formations. They were more structured, almost like circuit boards. As he watched, the crystals began pulsing in rhythm with the energy sparks from Venna's device. The connection hit him like a thunderbolt. Luna's abilities weren't just artistic, they were technological. Her crystal patterns were somehow interfacing with their advanced technology. "Luna," he called softly, drawing both aliens' attention. He pointed between the crystal patterns and Venna's device, trying to communicate his realization. "You can help fix it." Venna's eyes widened as she understood. She spoke gently to Luna in their musical language, and the child hesitantly placed one hand on her mother's wrist device while keeping the other on her crystal creation. The patterns began glowing brighter, and for a moment, the air around them shimmered with the beginning of a cloaking field. But the effort proved too much for Luna. The field collapsed, and she slumped against her mother, clearly exhausted. Venna gathered her daughter close, stroking her head and murmuring what must have been words of comfort and encouragement. Thomas watched them, his mind racing through options. They needed time for Luna to develop her abilities, time for Venna to heal completely, time to figure out a more permanent solution. But time was the one thing their pursuers wouldn't give them. He began unpacking more of his supplies, laying out medical equipment and emergency rations. As he worked, he caught Venna watching him, her expression unreadable but intense. She pointed to his medical bag, then to her healing wound, then made a gesture that encompassed all three of them. The meaning was clear, they were in this together now. "We'll figure this out," he promised, knowing they couldn't understand his words but hoping they could feel his determination. "Whatever's hunting you will have to go through me first." Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering their tracks and obscuring the cave entrance from distant eyes. But somewhere up there, in the cold darkness of space, something was watching. Waiting. Hunting. Thomas checked his weapons one last time before settling in for what he knew would be a long night. He might be just one human against unknown alien forces, but he'd learned long ago that the most dangerous opponent wasn't the biggest or strongest, it was the one who had something precious to protect. And now he had two somethings to protect, even if they were 60 feet tall. Dawn broke over the mountains, painting the snow-covered peaks in shades of crimson and gold. Thomas stood at the observation post, scanning the horizon through his binoculars. The past week had settled into an uneasy routine, watching, waiting, preparing for the inevitable. The sound of crystalline chimes echoed from the cave behind him. Luna was practicing again. Her abilities had grown stronger each day, the glowing patterns she created becoming more complex and purposeful. Sometimes, when she worked alongside her mother, they managed to generate a stable cloaking field for almost an hour before it collapsed. But it wasn't enough. Not anymore. The first sign of trouble came as a subtle change in air pressure. Thomas's ears popped, and the hairs on the back of his neck stood up. He'd felt something similar during his military days, right before artillery strikes, the calm before the storm. "Venna," he shouted, rushing back into the cave. "They're here." The massive alien was already moving, her movements fluid despite her size. She swept Luna behind her as three sleek objects streaked across the sky, their metallic surfaces reflecting the morning sun. They were smaller than Thomas had expected, perhaps 20 feet long, but they moved with an unnatural precision that spoke of advanced technology. The vessels took up positions around the mountain, forming a triangle with the cave entrance at its center. A high-pitched whine filled the air, and Thomas's electronic equipment began to malfunction, screens flickering with static. Vena's wrist device sparked and sputtered. She spoke quickly to Luna, her musical language carrying notes of urgency and fear. The child pressed her hands against the cave wall, and crystalline patterns spread rapidly across the rock face, creating what looked like a defensive matrix. A voice boomed from outside, speaking in the same harmonic language as Vena and Luna. Thomas couldn't understand the words, but the tone was clear, a demand, an ultimatum. Vena responded, her voice sharp with defiance. The answer came in the form of energy beams that sliced through the air, striking the cave entrance. Luna's crystal matrix flared brilliant white, absorbing the impact. The child staggered but kept her hands pressed to the wall, her small face tight with concentration. "They're after her power, aren't they?" Thomas asked Vena as he checked his weapons. "That's why you ran." Vena nodded grimly. She touched her wrist device, and despite its damaged state, it projected a series of images. Thomas saw what looked like a massive space station, where children with abilities like Luna's were being collected, or harvested. The images showed the children's energy being siphoned away to power vast machines and weapons. "They're using them as batteries," Thomas realized with horror. "And Luna must be exceptionally powerful." Another blast rocked the cave entrance. Luna's crystal matrix held, but hairline cracks appeared in its surface. The child was trembling with effort, her glow flickering like a candle in the wind. Thomas made a decision. He'd set up more than just surveillance equipment over the past week. Reaching into his pack, he pulled out a remote detonator. "Vena," he called, pointing to the sky where the enemy vessels hovered. Then he showed her the detonator and mimed an explosion. Her eyes widened with understanding. The alien hunters were advanced, but they weren't infallible. While their attention was focused on the cave entrance, they'd failed to notice the small drones Thomas had deployed days ago, each carrying a payload of high-grade military explosives. Now those drones waited high above, hidden in the morning sun. Vena touched her daughter's shoulder, speaking softly. Luna nodded without taking her hands from the wall. The crystal matrix pulsed brighter, and Thomas could feel its protective field strengthening. He pressed the detonator. The explosion was massive, far larger than it should have been. Later, Thomas would realize that Luna's crystals had somehow amplified the blast, turning his conventional explosives into something far more powerful. Two of the enemy vessels were caught completely by surprise, torn apart in spectacular fireballs. The third vessel wheeled away, but Vena was ready. She thrust her hand forward, and despite her damaged technology, a burst of energy shot from her wrist device. The blast caught the fleeing vessel's engine, sending it spiraling into the mountainside in a shower of debris. Silence fell, broken only by the sound of snow sliding off tree branches and the faint hum of Luna's crystal matrix. The child finally lowered her hands, swaying with exhaustion. Vena caught her daughter as she stumbled, lifting her with infinite gentleness. But Thomas knew this was only the beginning. He rushed to examine the wreckage through his binoculars, noting the advanced technology scattered across the snow. "They'll send more," he said grimly. "These were just scouts." Vena made a sound of agreement. She set Luna down carefully and began gathering the scattered pieces of the destroyed vessels. Thomas watched in amazement as she and Luna worked together, using the child's crystal powers to integrate the alien technology with their damaged equipment. As they worked, Vena projected another image, a vast armada of ships, waiting somewhere beyond Earth's solar system. The hunters hadn't committed their full forces yet, but they would. Luna was too valuable to them. The child looked up at Thomas, her galaxy-like eyes filled with a wisdom far beyond her years. She reached out and touched his hand, and in that moment, a spark of her power flowed into him. He gasped as images filled his mind, countless worlds, ancient civilizations, and a power that could either create or destroy entire galaxies. Now he understood. Luna wasn't just gifted, she was an evolutionary leap, a being whose abilities could reshape the very fabric of reality. The hunters didn't just want to use her power, they wanted to control the next step in their species' development. "We need to move," Thomas said as the vision faded. "This place isn't safe anymore." He pointed to the deeper mountains, where old mining tunnels formed a complex network. "We can use the tunnels, set up multiple bases. Make them chase shadows while we figure out a more permanent solution." Venna nodded, but her expression was troubled. She showed him one final image, Earth's moon, with strange energy readings emanating from its dark side. Something was already there, waiting. The real battle hadn't even begun. Thomas checked his remaining supplies and began packing. As he worked, he couldn't help but smile grimly. He'd signed up to help 2 refugees, but now he was caught in the middle of an intergalactic conflict with the fate of multiple worlds hanging in the balance. Just another day in the mountains. The old mining tunnels stretched beneath the mountains like a labyrinth, their darkness broken only by the soft glow of Luna's crystalline formations. Thomas led their small group through the narrow passages, consulting maps that were decades out of date. Behind him, Venna moved with surprising grace despite her massive size, her head nearly brushing the reinforced ceiling. 2 weeks had passed since the scout ship's destruction. 2 weeks of constant movement, of sleeping in shifts, of jumping at every echo. But something else had changed too. Luna's powers were growing exponentially. The child no longer just created crystal patterns, she transformed entire sections of the tunnel network, reinforcing weak points and creating new passages that defied normal geology. Her abilities were evolving beyond anything Venna had seen before. "We need to rest," Thomas called out, spotting a larger chamber ahead. The space had once been a major intersection of mining operations, its ceiling soaring nearly 100 feet high. Perfect for their giant companions to stretch properly for the first time in days. As they settled in, Thomas noticed Luna studying her hands with an intense expression. Suddenly, crystals began growing from her fingertips, spreading outward in fractal patterns that filled the air with prismatic light. But these weren't like her previous creations, these crystals seemed to bend space itself, creating impossible geometries that hurt his eyes to look at. Venna made a sound of alarm, reaching for her daughter. But before she could touch her, Luna's eyes began to glow with an intensity that filled the chamber with blinding light. The ground trembled, and for a moment, Thomas could have sworn he saw other realities bleeding through the walls, glimpses of alien worlds and distant stars. "Luna," he shouted, rushing forward despite his instinct to run. "Luna, you need to control it." The child's head snapped toward him, her galaxy-like eyes now blazing like supernovas. When she spoke, her voice echoed with harmonics that made the crystals resonate. "They're coming." The words were in perfect English. Before Thomas could process this development, his portable scanner began screaming. Multiple contacts were approaching from above, far more than last time. The hunters had found them, and they'd brought an army. Venna's wrist device sprang to life, projecting a tactical display that showed at least 20 vessels descending through the atmosphere. But something was wrong. The ships weren't heading for their location, they were spreading out in a pattern that covered most of the mountain range. "They're not just hunting us anymore," Thomas realized. "They're going to expose themselves to the whole world." Luna stepped forward, her crystalline constructs still swirling around her. "They want everyone to know," she said, her English now perfect but overlaid with harmonic tones. "They want Earth's governments to give us up willingly." Thomas stared at her in shock. "You can speak our language now? I can do so much more." Luna raised her hands, and the crystals around her pulsed with energy. "I can see everything, all possibilities, all futures. The hunters don't just want my power, they want to control how our species evolves. They've done this before, on countless worlds. Vena spoke rapidly in their native tongue, but Luna responded in English for Thomas's benefit. No, Mother. I'm not losing control. I'm finally understanding what I am, what we both are. Our people weren't meant to be weapons or power sources. We were meant to be bridges between realities. The scanner's alarm grew more urgent. The enemy vessels were beginning their descent, and something massive had just appeared in orbit, a mothership that dwarfed anything Thomas had ever imagined. They'll destroy this mountain range to get to us, Luna continued, her voice heavy with knowledge no child should have to bear. Thousands will die unless we stop them. Thomas checked his weapons, pathetically inadequate against this level of threat, and tried to think strategically. The tunnels are mapped for miles. We could try to lose them in the network, maybe set up more traps. No more running, Luna said firmly. The crystals around her began to pulse in complex patterns, and Thomas felt reality itself growing thin. But I need your help. Both of you. Vena knelt beside her daughter, placing one massive hand gently on her shoulder. The contact caused energy to arc between them, and suddenly Vena's damaged technology began to repair itself, enhanced by Luna's crystalline structures. Thomas, Luna turned to him, holding out her small hand. You've protected us, cared for us, treated us like family. Now I need your courage. What I'm about to do, it's never been done before. He looked at her offered hand, small yet capable of reshaping reality itself. Then at Vena, who had trusted him with her most precious treasure. Finally, at his own hands, calloused from years of military service and weeks of helping these remarkable beings. The scanner screamed again. The enemy ships were almost upon them. Thomas took Luna's hand. The world exploded into light and possibility. Through their connection, he could see what Luna saw, the quantum nature of reality, the threads that bound all things together, the infinite potential in every moment. He understood now why the hunters were so desperate to control this power. But Luna wasn't using it the way they would have. Instead of a weapon, she was creating something new, a bridge, a sanctuary, a possibility that had never existed before. The crystals spread outward, not just through the physical space of the cave but through reality itself. As the enemy ships began their attack, reality rippled like water disturbed by a stone. The war for Luna's future had begun. But this time, they weren't running. This time, they were changing the rules of the game itself. Reality rippled like a pond in a storm. Thomas felt Luna's power flowing through him, transforming his understanding of what was possible. Through their connected hands, he saw existence as she did, an infinite web of possibilities, each choice creating new branches, new futures. Vena's technology had fully integrated with Luna's crystals, turning the cave chamber into a nexus of otherworldly energy. Above them, the hunter ships opened fire, their energy weapons powerful enough to vaporize mountains. But as the blast struck Luna's crystalline barrier, something extraordinary happened. The attacks didn't just stop, they transformed. Each blast of destructive energy was caught in Luna's crystal matrix, reformed, and channeled into something new. The very physics of their weapons were being rewritten at a quantum level. What are you doing? Thomas asked, his voice whisper quiet with awe. Luna's eyes blazed with starlight as she worked. Teaching them the lesson they never learned. Power isn't meant to be taken or controlled. It's meant to be understood. The massive mothership in orbit began charging its main weapon, a planet killer capable of shattering Earth's crust. But Luna was ready. The crystals around them pulsed with impossible colors, and suddenly the chamber was filled with windows into other realities. Thomas saw countless versions of Earth, of Vena's homeworld, of civilizations that had risen and fallen across the cosmos. Look, Luna commanded, her voice carrying to every hunter ship, every soldier sent to capture her. Look at what you're really fighting for. Through the quantum windows, they all saw the truth, the civilizations the hunters had destroyed in their quest for power, the children they'd sacrificed, the futures they'd erased. But Luna showed them something else too, possibilities. Futures where different choices led to cooperation instead of conquest, where power was shared instead of hoarded. The mothership fired. Luna raised her free hand, and reality bent. The planet-killing beam struck her crystal matrix and split into 1,000 streams of pure possibility. Each stream showed a different outcome, a different future. The hunters were forced to watch as their own weapon became a lens through which they saw the consequences of their choices. You wanted evolution? Luna's voice resonated through space itself. This is what real evolution looks like. The crystal matrix expanded, encompassing not just the chamber but the entire mountain range. Within its facets, time and space became fluid, malleable. Thomas watched in amazement as Luna rewove the very fabric of reality around them. But the effort was tremendous. Even with Vena's technology amplifying her power, Luna's small frame trembled with the strain. Blood trickled from her nose, glowing with the same otherworldly light as her eyes. Luna, Thomas squeezed her hand, feeling her pain through their connection. You don't have to do this alone. Vena knelt beside them, adding her own strength to their link. Through their shared consciousness, Thomas understood at last what Luna was attempting. She wasn't just defending against the hunters, she was trying to heal the damage they'd done to the universe itself. The mothership fired again, desperately trying to break through. But this time, when the beam struck Luna's matrix, something fundamental changed. The energy was absorbed, transformed, and reflected back not as a weapon, but as pure understanding. Every hunter, every soldier, every being connected to their vast fleet suddenly saw the universe as Luna did. They felt the interconnectedness of all things, the responsibility that came with power, the beauty of possibility itself. The attack stopped. In orbit, the mothership's weapons powered down. The smaller vessels retreated, their crews forever changed by what they'd witnessed. Luna's gift to them wasn't defeat, it was enlightenment. But the victory came at a cost. As the crystal matrix began to fade, Luna collapsed into her mother's arms, completely drained. Thomas felt their connection weaken, but not before he caught a glimpse of one last vision, a future where humans and Luna's people worked together, sharing knowledge and culture, building something greater than either could achieve alone. Is it over? He asked softly, still holding Luna's small hand. The child smiled weakly, her glow dim but steady. No, she whispered. It's just beginning. Vena cradled her daughter, tears of starlight rolling down her alien features. She spoke in their musical language, but Thomas understood now, not the words, but the feeling. Love. Gratitude. Hope. In the days that followed, the world would change. Humanity would learn they weren't alone in the universe. The hunters would return not as conquerors, but as students, seeking to understand the power they'd once tried to steal. And in a remote mountain range, a former military medic would continue to watch over his extraordinary family, one human, two giants, all of them guardians of a new reality they'd created together. Luna's crystals remained, scattered throughout the mountains like windows into possibility itself. And sometimes, on quiet nights, Thomas would sit with his alien companions and watch the stars, knowing that the universe was far more wonderful and strange than he'd ever imagined. He'd set out to protect them, but in the end, they'd all protected each other. And in doing so, they'd changed not just their own futures, but the future of everything. The end was just another beginning.